Hello, little eager to learn flowers. Have you ever felt like you'd rather stay silent than argue? Or found yourself trapped in meaningless conversations where people impose their opinions without ever considering yours? Maybe you've even felt overlooked, unheard, like your presence was nothing more than a background detail in someone else's story. If you've ever experienced moments like these, you are not alone. But remember, silence doesn't mean you've lost. It simply proves that you are wise enough not to waste your energy on things that don't matter. And don't forget, this isn't weakness, it's intelligence. It's not that you can't argue. It's that you understand peace is far more valuable than proving who's right and who's wrong. This is the mark of someone who has lived, who knows their worth, and who no longer feels the need to conform to things that no longer serve them. At this stage in life, you no longer have to endure empty conversations or maintain relationships that drain you. What if you chose solitude over forced socialization, set boundaries, and embraced the quiet life you deserve? Let's explore why more and more people over 70 are choosing stillness over social obligation, and why this may be the wisest decision you'll ever make. Number 1. Mr. Richard. When family no longer listens for most of his life, Mr. Richard, a 76-year-old man, was the foundation of his family. He worked tirelessly to provide for his children, gave them everything they needed, and was always the one they turned to for advice. His words carried weight, and his presence commanded respect. But as the years passed, something changed. The man who was once the pillar of his family was now just a shadow in the background. His children made decisions without consulting him. His grandchildren barely acknowledged his opinions. Conversations that once felt warm and engaging were now rushed, dismissive, and indifferent. It started with small things. A family dinner where his advice was ignored. A conversation where his words were cut off. A moment when he realized no one was really listening. He would be in a room full of loved ones, yet somehow he felt invisible. One evening, during a family gathering, Richard shared a piece of advice with his grandson about career choices. Before he could finish, his grandson glanced at his phone, nodded absent-mindedly, and changed the subject. His own daughter barely noticed and kept talking about her plans for the future, plans that she had never discussed with him. That night, Richard sat alone in his chair, staring at the walls of his home. He had spent his entire life raising and guiding his family, yet now, he felt like a guest in his own house. He had always imagined growing old surrounded by love, respect, and meaningful conversations, but instead, he was met with disinterest, impatience, and silence. Then came the realization. He was no longer seen as someone valuable, but as someone outdated. At first, it hurt deeply. The people he had sacrificed so much for no longer saw him as the wise father and grandfather, but as an old man with outdated opinions. But as painful as it was, he knew he had a choice. Continue forcing himself into conversations where he wasn't respected, or reclaim his dignity and prioritize his own peace. So, he made a quiet decision. He stopped offering advice where it wasn't wanted. He no longer forced himself into conversations where he wasn't valued. Instead, he began investing his time in the things that brought him personal joy, reading books that stimulated his mind, writing down his own life lessons, and spending time with old friends who truly valued his wisdom. The less he chased after attention from those who dismissed him, the lighter he felt. He wasn't retreating from his family. He was simply choosing not to beg for a place in their conversations. And surprisingly, this shift brought him something unexpected: peace. Key lesson: respect isn't something that should fade with age. If the people around you no longer value your voice, you don't have to fight for their attention. You can choose to focus on yourself instead. If you've ever felt unheard, unappreciated, or treated as if your thoughts no longer matter, maybe it's time to stop seeking validation and start embracing your own self-worth. Are you constantly trying to be heard in spaces where no one listens? Maybe it's time to listen to yourself instead. Number 2. Mr. Martin. When socializing becomes a burden for most of his life, Mr. Martin, a 70-year-old man, was known for being friendly and outgoing. He spent decades attending family gatherings, chatting with neighbors, and never missing a meetup with friends. He believed that staying socially engaged would bring him joy in his later years. But over time, he realized that reality was no longer the same. The conversations he once enjoyed now felt exhausting. He no longer felt truly connected to the people around him. His grandchildren were always distracted by their phones. His friends only talked about illnesses, politics, or topics he had lost interest in. He smiled, nodded, and tried to fit in. But deep down, he felt like an outsider among those he once felt closest to. One evening, Mr. Martin found himself at a family gathering, surrounded by laughter and chatter, yet he felt an overwhelming emptiness inside. He looked around and realized he no longer belonged there. Everyone was busy in their own conversations, not noticing that he sat in silence, drained, wondering if he should continue forcing himself into these gatherings. That night, Mr. Martin had a moment of clarity. He realized that forcing himself to engage in conversations that no longer brought him joy was only making him more exhausted. What he truly needed wasn't more social connections, but rather peace of mind. So he gradually distanced himself from unnecessary social interactions. He declined invitations to gatherings that he knew would drain him. Instead, he spent more time reading, walking in the park, listening to music, and embracing the quiet moments that allowed him to reconnect with himself. And surprisingly, he didn't feel lonely. Instead, he felt relieved, at peace, and more in tune with himself than ever before. Key lesson: we don't need to force ourselves to maintain conversations and relationships that no longer bring us joy. Avoiding certain social interactions doesn't mean isolation. It means choosing freedom, choosing peace, and prioritizing what truly nurtures our well-being. Are you spending energy on relationships that exhaust you? Maybe it's time to prioritize yourself and embrace the solitude you truly need. Number 3, Mrs. Evelyn. Learning to set boundaries for a healthier life. For most of her life, Mrs. Evelyn, a 72-year-old woman, was the heart of her family. She was the one who hosted holiday gatherings, planned family barbecues, and made sure everyone stayed connected. She took pride in being the one people relied on, always saying yes to every request, every invitation, every favor. But what happens when being the family's rock starts to feel like a burden rather than a joy? As the years went by, Mrs. Evelyn started feeling exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. She no longer found joy in organizing events. Instead, she felt like it was an obligation, an expectation that drained her more and more each time. But how could she say no? Wouldn't that make her seem selfish, ungrateful, or even distant from her own family? Then came one particularly exhausting weekend. She had just finished hosting a large family gathering, spending days preparing food, making sure everything was perfect, and keeping everyone entertained. When the last guest left, she sat down, completely drained. Her legs ached, her back was sore, and worst of all, her heart felt heavy with exhaustion. She realized that she had been pouring all of her energy into making others happy, but had completely neglected herself. That night, as she lay in bed unable to sleep from sheer exhaustion, she had a painful realization. If she kept living like this, always saying yes, always putting others before herself, she would burn out completely. She knew it was time to make a change. At first, it was incredibly difficult to set boundaries. Saying no to family events or asking others to take on responsibilities made her feel guilty. She worried that her family would see her differently or think she didn't care anymore. But the truth was, she needed this change to survive. Slowly, she started making small adjustments. She would decline invitations when she felt too tired, suggest smaller, more manageable gatherings, and most importantly, ask for help instead of taking on everything alone. The results were life-changing. She no longer spent her days overwhelmed and exhausted. Instead, she had more energy for the things that truly made her happy: gardening, morning walks, reading, and spending time with loved ones on her own terms. She no longer felt like a servant to her family's expectations, but rather a person who had reclaimed control over her own well-being. Key lesson: setting boundaries isn't about pushing people away. It's about protecting your own health and happiness. If saying yes to everyone else is making you feel drained and exhausted, maybe it's time to start saying yes to yourself instead. Are you constantly overextending yourself for others? Have you forgotten how to prioritize your own needs? It's never too late to take back control and create a life that nourishes you instead of draining you. Number 4. Mr. Walter. When too many relationships don't mean true happiness for most of his life, Mr. Walter, a 75-year-old man, was surrounded by people. He had a large circle of acquaintances, never missing a weekend gathering, a neighborhood event, or a casual coffee meetup with old friends. He believed that staying socially active meant staying fulfilled. The more people in his life, the richer his life would be. But as the years passed, he started to feel something was missing. The laughter, the endless small talk, the social buzz. None of it felt as satisfying as it once did. He would leave these gatherings feeling strangely empty, like he had spent hours talking, but had not truly connected with anyone. Then came the night that changed everything. He had just returned home from yet another dinner party. A room full of familiar faces, conversations flowing effortlessly. But as he sat alone in his quiet house afterward, a deep sadness washed over him. Why did he feel lonelier after being surrounded by people? He thought back to the conversations, shallow discussions about sports, politics, gossip about people he barely knew. No one had asked how he was really feeling. No one had truly listened. That's when he realized the painful truth. He was filling his time with people, but not with real connections. Walter decided to make a change. Instead of accepting every invitation out of habit, he started to ask himself a hard question. Do I truly enjoy spending time with these people? The answer, more often than not, was no. So, he slowly began cutting out the noise. He stopped attending events that left him feeling drained. He let go of acquaintances who only reached out when they needed something. Instead, he focused on the people who truly mattered, his daughter, his childhood friend who had always been there, and the few people in his life who genuinely cared to listen. The more he distanced himself from superficial relationships, the more he realized how much energy he had wasted trying to maintain connections that never truly fed his soul. And surprisingly, instead of feeling lonelier, he felt lighter, freer, and more at peace than ever before. Key lesson: more relationships don't mean more happiness. If you've ever felt exhausted from keeping up with social obligations that don't bring you joy, maybe it's time to prioritize quality over quantity. Ask yourself, are you surrounding yourself with people out of habit, or because they truly enrich your life? If the answer isn't clear, maybe it's time to let go of the noise and focus on the connections that truly matter. Number 5. Mrs. Eleanor. Finding true peace in solitude. For years, Mrs. Eleanor, a 78-year-old woman, believed that staying socially active was the key to happiness. She attended community gatherings, kept up with family events, and met friends for coffee whenever possible. She had always been told that being around others would keep her engaged and fulfilled. But as time passed, she started noticing a pattern that deeply unsettled her. After social interactions, instead of feeling energized, she felt drained, exhausted, and strangely disconnected from herself. She would return home from a lunch with friends, yet her heart felt heavy. The conversations were always the same, talking about other people, complaining about health issues, rehashing old memories. There were no real moments of depth, no conversations that truly touched her soul. One evening, after a particularly exhausting family visit, she sat alone in her favorite chair and asked herself, why do I feel worse after spending time with people? It was a painful realization. The noise, the obligations, the constant need to engage, it wasn't making her happy anymore. She was losing herself in all the chatter. That was when she decided to make a change. Instead of forcing herself to be social just because it was expected, she started choosing herself. She spent more time walking by the lake near her home, letting the quietness calm her mind. She rediscovered her love for reading, for sitting in silence with a book and a cup of tea, without the pressure to entertain or engage in meaningless conversations. She began meditating in the mornings, allowing herself to simply exist in the stillness, free from expectations. At first, she felt guilty. Society had always told her that being alone meant being lonely. But soon, she realized that solitude wasn't loneliness, it was freedom. The deeper she embraced this new way of life, the lighter she felt. She no longer had to pretend to enjoy interactions that left her feeling drained. She no longer had to fill her time with people just to avoid being alone. Instead, she found true peace in her own presence. Key lesson: sometimes, being surrounded by people doesn't mean being connected. If you've ever felt exhausted by socializing, if conversations feel repetitive and unfulfilling, maybe it's time to embrace solitude instead of fearing it. Solitude isn't loneliness. It's a chance to listen to yourself, to heal, and to find peace in your own presence. What if the stillness you've been avoiding is exactly what your soul needs? Number 6, Mr. Thomas. Choosing personal growth over social expectations for most of his life, Mr. Thomas, an 80-year-old man, believed that staying socially active was what he was supposed to do. He attended every gathering, accepted every invitation, and made sure to always be present in his family and community. He thought that being surrounded by people meant he was living a fulfilling life. But as the years passed, he started feeling something he never expected: emptiness. Every weekend was filled with events. He went to birthdays, anniversaries, casual meetups, and holiday dinners. Yet, despite being constantly surrounded by people, he felt like something was missing. The conversations were predictable, the interactions repetitive. Everyone talked, but no one truly listened. He was physically present, but mentally, he felt distant, like an outsider in his own life. One evening, after attending yet another family dinner where he smiled, nodded, and played his expected role, he returned home and sat in silence, overwhelmed by a painful thought. Why am I spending all my time with others but feeling more alone than ever? That moment changed everything. He realized that he had been living for social expectations, not for himself. He had spent decades keeping up with others, but in doing so, he had neglected his own personal growth. So, he made a bold decision. He started saying no. He stopped attending gatherings that felt like obligations. He let go of relationships that were based on routine rather than real connection. Instead, he focused on what truly brought him joy. Things he had long abandoned because he was too busy trying to meet society's expectations. He picked up his old passion for painting, something he hadn't touched in years. He began reading books that challenged his mind, learning new things instead of listening to the same conversations over and over. For the first time in a long time, he felt excited to wake up in the morning, not because of an event on his calendar, but because he had time to explore, reflect, and grow. And the best part, he wasn't lonely. In fact, he felt more fulfilled than he ever had during his socially busy years. Key lesson: sometimes the greatest fulfillment comes from within, not from external validation. If you've ever felt trapped in social obligations that bring you no real joy, maybe it's time to ask yourself, am I living for others, or am I truly living for myself? The world may expect you to be present in every room, but perhaps the most important place to be present is within your own mind, exploring the things that make you feel truly alive. Number 7, Mr. Leonard. The peace that comes from slowing down for decades. Mr. Leonard, a 73-year-old man, lived a life of responsibility and obligation. He was always working, always providing, always making sure his family had everything they needed. He never missed a birthday, a holiday gathering, or a family event. His schedule was always full, his days always busy. But then, retirement came. For the first time in his life, he had no deadlines, no urgent tasks, no one depending on him. He had always imagined that this newfound freedom would bring relief, but instead, he felt lost. At first, he tried to maintain the same social life he had before. He kept attending family dinners, reconnecting with old colleagues, and showing up at every event. But something felt different. The conversations seemed repetitive, the events felt forced, and the joy he once found in being busy was gone. Instead of feeling fulfilled, he felt drained and disconnected, like he was just going through the motions without any real purpose. Then, one afternoon, after yet another weekend spent attending social gatherings that left him exhausted, he sat alone in his living room, staring at the walls, wondering why he felt so empty. The constant pressure to stay active, to keep up, to always be present, it wasn't making him happy. It was exhausting him. And then, a thought crossed his mind. What if I just stopped? What if I stopped saying yes to everything and allowed myself to simply be? So he did. He slowly started stepping back. He stopped accepting invitations out of obligation. He let go of the idea that he had to be everywhere, for everyone, all the time. Instead, he started focusing on what truly brought him peace. Instead of rushing from one event to another, he spent his mornings sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the sunrise. Instead of engaging in endless small talk, he found comfort in tending to his garden, feeling the soil in his hands, listening to the birds sing. Instead of forcing himself to socialize just to avoid being alone, he embraced solitude, allowing himself to slow down and rediscover the joy of his own company. And something incredible happened. He started feeling at peace for the first time in years. The stress, the exhaustion, the pressure to always be available, it all faded away. He no longer felt the need to prove his presence in other people's lives. Instead, he started living for himself. Key lesson: slowing down isn't about isolation. It's about giving yourself permission to enjoy life at your own pace. If you've ever felt exhausted from always being on, always keeping up, always meeting expectations, maybe it's time to ask yourself, am I truly living? Or am I just staying busy? Sometimes, the most fulfilling moments come in the stillness, in the quiet, in the simple joy of just being. What if slowing down is exactly what your soul has been longing for? Maybe it's time to choose yourself, without guilt. For years, we were told that staying busy, maintaining relationships, and always showing up for others was the key to a meaningful life. But what happens when those expectations no longer bring joy, but only exhaustion? Through the stories of Mr. Richard, Mr. Martin, Mrs. Evelyn, Mr. Walter, Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Leonard, we see a painful but necessary truth. Happiness isn't found in forcing yourself to hold onto relationships, responsibilities, or routines that no longer serve you. Maybe you felt it too. That exhaustion after a social gathering, the frustration of not being heard, the pressure to keep saying yes when your heart is screaming for rest. But what if choosing peace over obligation isn't selfish, but the very thing you need to truly enjoy life? Stepping back from unnecessary social interactions, prioritizing your mental and emotional well-being, and embracing solitude doesn't mean loneliness. It means freedom. It means making space for real connections, for personal growth, and most importantly, for yourself. Where are you from? If you agree with this perspective, share your thoughts or support this post by pressing 9. And remember, life isn't a race to please others. It's a journey to rediscover the peace that has always been yours.